I'm Stephanie from WorkSafe Tasmania, and I'll be your moderator today. In recognition of the deep history and culture of this island, we acknowledge Tasmanian Aboriginal people, the original and continuing custodians of the land, sea and sky. We acknowledge and pay our respects to all Tasmanian Aboriginal people, all of whom have survived invasion and dispossession and continue to maintain their identity, culture and Aboriginal rights. Please take a moment now to read the following slide about information received today. Please use the chat tab on your screen to type questions and comments for today's presenter. Those questions and comments will be answered throughout the presentation. Only presenter webcams will be used, and today's webinar is also being recorded. It is now my pleasure to introduce your presenter today, Dr. Georgi Toma from Heart and Brain Works. Georgi is an expert in workplace psychological health and safety, including psychosocial risk, stress and burnout. She's a Hobart-based consultant and researcher working for Heart and Brain Works and the University of Auckland. Georgi conducts psychological risk assessments and advises workplaces on effective controls to eliminate and mitigate risks. She has worked with RMIT University, Hitachi Energy, Christchurch City Council and others to create healthy and safe work environments. And we welcome Georgi today.
Thank you so much. A pleasure to be here with you and everyone. And I hope you find this session useful. So let's get down to it. Before, I just wanted to give everyone a quick understanding of where the information I'm about to share with you comes from. Part of it comes from research evidence, and the other part comes from the work that we do in consulting companies, right? So we do three main things at Heart and Brain Works. We conduct psychosocial hazards audits and risk assessment. So a lot of the information I'll be sharing with you today comes from that. We also do mental health training, and we also train managers in psychosocial risk management, which is really important, as line managers play a key role in that. So today we're going to see the fact that we're going to talk about three things: high workload, how to identify this hazard, and suggestions for best practice. I just noticed one thing, Stephanie, which is the fact that animation doesn't seem to be working. So I'm going to try the next slide. Yeah. So the animation doesn't seem to be working. And that might be a little bit difficult to go through everything. So I'm not sure what we can do to support that. What we could do is I could share the slides from my screen, and that would mean that the animation would be working. Because otherwise it's going to be quite tricky to go through the content if it all comes up at the same time. What do you think? I think you're muted.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, we can definitely try that. We can try that, yes.
All right, okay. I see a message that perhaps animation will not work in Demio at all. Even if I share from my computer. I'm just trying to clarify that before we actually do anything. Sorry, everyone, about that. Okay, I will try to share my screen with everyone. Just bear with me 1 second while we go through this. Okay. Can you allow me to share my screen, please? I think I need permission to do that. Oh, actually, yeah, let's see. I think this works. Yay. Are you able to see the screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So why don't we start by looking or discussing, why are we talking about this now? Why are we talking about high workload in the context of psychosocial risk? So I want to share with you a couple of reasons why. And the first one is going to be related to all these headlines that we see in newspapers across Australia, across New Zealand, and newspaper articles that we've seen for a while now, right? So for example, Lenny Bogdanoff leaves OpenAI reflecting high workload with 6-day weeks. right? Working 55 plus hours a week kills 745,000 people a year. So these are very interesting. So the idea is that what we've seen over the past years is an increase in high workload across different industries. But we've also seen an increase in awareness of the importance, or rather the consequences of that high workload. So we know from research studies that working 55 hours or more per week is associated with 35% higher risk of a stroke and 17% higher risk of dying from ischemic heart disease compared with working 35 or 40 hours a week. Similarly, in a study from Professor Jar, this study has been conducted across all of New Zealand. And in fact, Professor Jared Har, has been measuring burnout in the New Zealand workforce over the past years. And what he's found in his research is that working more than 55 hours a week makes someone 416 times more likely to develop burnout. So we're looking at pretty serious consequences. And last but not least, the reason why we're talking about this now is that we have the new legislation that has come through in all territories. Victoria is still under consultation with their amendment, but pretty much we have an agreement across all states that psychosocial risk is important, that it is a legal obligation for organizations to identify psychosocial hazards. And why has this legislation come about, right? So we have, for one, we have the Marie Boland review into Australia's health and safety laws, and the fact that she identified a gap there related to mental health at work, right? Even though the law already told us that it was an employer's responsibility to ensure the health and safety of its people, both physical and psychological, the psychological aspect wasn't really developed or looked into it properly, right? So that's one thing that prompted us to see these changes in legislation. Another thing that prompted that was the COVID pandemic, right? And the fact that after the COVID pandemic, increases in mental health distress, in anxiety, in depression, burnout rates has been steadily growing. And even now, that continues to be the case. And recently, I was just looking before this webinar at some statistic published by WorkSafe around mental health in Australians, and 1 in 6 Australians are suffering from a mental health condition, and the primary work factor related to that is work pressure, right? So it's quite interesting what we're seeing. So those are some of the reasons why we're seeing this legislation. Of course, another important one, and maybe the last one I'll mention here, is an increase in worker compensation claims with a psychological component. We're seeing this across all states and across all industries. And we know that those particular types of claims, they take much longer for an individual to return to work, therefore they are more costly. And the time required for recovery is significantly longer than just a physical injury. So these are some of the reasons why we are talking about psychosocial risk and why we are talking about high workload in particular. So before I move on, I always like inviting people to share their opinion. So this is where I would like to invite you in the chat. Can you share your thoughts about how would you define high workload? I'm going to have a look at the chat and read out some of the answers that come through. And then, of course, I will share a definition with you, but I'd like this session to be, well, as interactive as we can in the context of a webinar. So if you were to be asked, okay, what's high workload? How would we define that? I'm going to wait for a second for you guys to put your answers. Yeah, have so much to do, don't know where to start. Work that cannot be achieved in standard work hours, 7 to 8 hour days. Cannot fit work tasks in normal work hours. High workload is where you are unable to complete the duties of your role in your work hours. Yeah, you can never catch up, not having time to drink water or go to the bathroom. Yeah, pretty true, right? Excessive task in ratio to work hours. So we see already a theme developing there, right? And you guys have really nailed it. So I am going to share, let me click. Yeah, more answers coming through, and I see the same trends really that we've mentioned there, and it's really spot on. So situations where the volume of work tasks and responsibilities exceeds what can realistically be managed within a given time frame or role, right? So keeping that in mind, I want us to discuss what underpins high workload, and what we can do about it, right? And in order to do that, I'm going to be sharing with you some information that has come from our psychosocial risk assessment. So basically, in our risk assessments, we look at over 30 hazards. And what's important with psychosocial hazards, two things that are important when you analyze them is, one, these are hazards that cannot be identified accurately in isolation. What do I mean by that? Psychosocial hazards, unlike physical hazards, they interact and they compound risk. So in order to see exactly what hazard represents a risk for your people, you actually have to see how they interact, which are compounding factors, which are mitigating factors or protective factors. So protective factors are those aspects of work that reduce the negative impact of psychosocial risks. One example, so the research is actually increasing in this, manager support. So good support from your manager is an incredibly protective factor, and it can reduce the impact of work overload, of role conflict, and even the onset of burnout symptoms, right? So from these audits, I want to share with you a couple of insights. First is that most prevalent hazards across different sectors that has come up for us is high workload, high work pace, so that's having to work really fast, having low role clarity, and offensive behaviors. So offensive behaviors is a broader category that comprises the typical ones: harassment, bullying, threats of violence, physical violence, but also one thing that we measure is incivility. So incivility means perceived disrespect with ambiguous intent. So someone's being disrespectful to you, you're not quite sure if they meant it or not, but nonetheless, you feel quite bad about it. You feel disrespected, right? And if you look across different industries, at least industries, if you look across different industries, you see that there's more or less, an even spread, if you will. And of course, you see that the typical ones that we know are at higher risk, such as public administration, education, healthcare, social services, right? So what I want to do that, I want to present to you a scenario. I'm going to show it in a minute. I'm going to read it out loud. And I would like us together to analyze what underpins high workload for this individual. It's a scenario about an employee. We'll give him a name. He's called Eric. And our task is to identify what underpins high workload for Eric. So here we go. Don't be afraid of the text. I'm going to read it out loud slowly. So Eric has been working for organization Y for 6 months. During this time, he consistently felt his workload was so high, he couldn't complete it during regular work hours. So he frequently works late. He noticed his colleagues and manager do the same. In fact, it seems to be a given that working overtime without compensation is the norm. Everyone is very committed to their work, and they seem to take their busyness as a badge of honor. Eric is finding that this is affecting his personal life, so he decides to do his best to work faster. He finds, however, that even though he focuses and works fast, the system he uses is very slow and clunky. Learning to use it was difficult, given that the training material didn't quite address the problems he was encountering, and his colleagues had not always been helpful, either because they were too busy or they didn't know how to help. Eric also finds it frustrating that he needs information from different teams to complete his work, and that this information is saved on different drives. He is also not sure who to contact in different teams to ask for support, and he often gets abrasive answers from members of one team in particular. He finds himself wasting a lot of time trying to retrieve the information he needs without asking them for help. Okay, time to put your thinking hats on. I want to invite you to write in the chat, what is causing Eric's high workload? Based on this scenario, what are contributing factors to his high workload? And again, I'm going to read out answers that come. Partly workplace culture, poor culture, lack of teamwork communication, lack of clear processes and procedures, poor leadership, unrealistic expectations, poor workflows and systems, inefficient working systems, inefficient and ineffective internal communication, company culture and acceptance of systems not supporting work, ineffective systems, poor training, lack of leadership. Someone says, I think I've worked in that office in the past. I think a lot of us have had similar experiences. This is modeled on several actually audits that we've done. Yeah, unclear expectations. Someone says everything. Right. So we notice here a variety of answers, and you're actually all right? So let's take it from the top down. So he starts off, so he's fairly new in his role, right? 6 months. He wants to do good work. So he notices that colleagues and manager do the same. So what we have there is an always on culture and an expectation that, well, everybody works overtime. That's how we do it here, right? Because we are committed to our work. And that's the idea that, oh, I'm super busy and that's a badge of honor. That means I am doing good work. I am a good person, right? So we have that type of belief that forms part of this organization's culture. Then what we notice, the second thing is the system, right? As you've rightly noticed, the system is ineffective, it's clunky. And there's a couple of things about this. So the training material is not up to speed. And then we notice that poor Eric is not receiving adequate support. As you've rightly noticed, he's not receiving adequate support from his manager, right? So that's lack of leadership, not good support from manager. He's not receiving the support he needs from colleagues. And his poor colleagues, probably they're also super busy, right? And they might also not know how to do things. Then we have the issue of information from different teams. So here we might deal with lack of process clarity and the fact that Eric isn't quite sure who to ask for support, right? Then we have the fact that information is saved on different drives. So he has to always remember, where do I find that piece of information? This is what we call cognitive load. So cognitive load is when we have to remember a lot of things or pay attention to a lot of things in our work. And it is very interesting, but high cognitive load consistently comes up in our audits. Then if we go to the last part of the scenario, we're seeing that a certain team is very abrasive with Eric when he tries to get some information out of them. So this is what we call an example of incivility, right? That's an example of how incivility can find its way in the workplace and negatively impact people, not only on a psychological level in the sense that, oh, I feel bad because I've been disrespected, but also in a very objective manner, increasing their workload or increasing the difficulty required to perform a task, which ultimately has as a downside effect the increase in workload. So we've looked at that, we've discussed that. So now I want to start talking about, okay, how do I identify high workload in our organizations? And I have a couple of questions for you. And the first one is, have you conducted already a risk assessment in your organization? And you can just pop in the chat a quick yes, no, or in progress. Yep, so we again see some answers coming through. Yes, no, in progress. Yeah, so we see quite maybe more no's than yeses at the moment. And quite a few in progress, so that's really good. Then my next question is, what methods did you use to identify hazards? This is quite important because, as I mentioned before, psychosocial hazards, they're complex to assess, partly due to their subjective nature, right? It's someone's subjective appraisal whether a particular aspect of work is stressful or not, and to what extent. However, when we assess them, this subjectivity shouldn't account or stand in the way of looking at those or getting accurate results, getting accurate and valid results, right? So when we think of psychosocial hazards, I mentioned the fact that they compound. I mentioned the fact that some are compounding, some are mitigating. It's also important for us to consider exposure, right? In order to assess whether a particular hazard is actually a risk, we need to assess exposure to it. So exposure meaning how long someone is experiencing that, how frequently, or if it is at high intensity or not. So we see here some answers, and we notice something quite interesting, a comment. We talk about the hazards, but they're never looked at in depth. And that's actually more common than you would think. And that's unfortunately a problem. So it is really important when we assess hazards that three things I'm going to say that are important. The first one is use quantitative and qualitative data. So quantitative data allows different algorithms to analyze how hazards interact, and it's really good. But qualitative data allows us to understand what are the underpinning causes. So if you look at Eric's example, we do an audit and we see, okay, the high workload shows up as a problem for the team Eric is in. But what's really underpinning that? Without qualitative data, we wouldn't know. So therefore, the controls that we put in place for it might not be effective, right? And just as the last question, did high work come up as a risk factor for you? I'm just curious. Again, you can say yes. For those of you who have actually conducted it already, yes, no, to some extent, right? And that's just curious. So I noticed here a question, how to address exposure when it is part of the everyday work. And I'm going to come back to this point in a moment to discuss hazards that are inherent in the work and what can we do, about that. And obviously I'm going to bring up work design, right? But I'm going to do that towards the end of the webinar, where I'll also give you an example of how this can look like in practice. So next, I'm going to give you a checklist. And this checklist is meant to help you identify if high workload is a problem in your organization. So in what follows, maybe if you have a pen and paper, it's going to be useful for you because I'm going to share with you some questions. And I'm just going to invite you on your piece of paper to answer them yes or no. And then you will add them up at the end, and you see to what extent high workload might be a problem for your organization. Bear in mind, this is a very rudimentary checklist. This is not a risk assessment, right? A risk assessment, a psychosocial risk assessment needs to have a validated and thorough methodology behind it. This is just, as I said, an invitation for you to think about things, right? Not an assessment. So here we go. Question 1. Is there an unspoken acceptance of high workload as normal and required in your organization? So again, quickly jot down on your piece of paper, yes, no. This is just for yourself. You don't have to share in the chat. It's just for yourself, a checklist for your organization. Second one, are your systems creating stress for your employees? And you'll notice already that what I'm including in this checklist are the main causes of high workload that have come up in our audits. Are your processes unclear or too complex? Yes or no? Is cross-team collaboration ineffective? Are there a lot of disrespectful behaviors tolerated in the organization? I noticed another question there that I'm going to come back to at the end, which is about do you believe we need to adjust work levels for individuals? The short answer is yes, and I'll come back to, well, the short answer is not a short answer. I'll come back to it at the end. Question 6, is there an implicit expectation to be always on, even when on leave? Yes, no. Is workforce planning ineffective or absent in your organization? 3 more to go. Do you have staff shortages? Are you experiencing rapid growth? Last one, do your people have to process a lot of information and make a lot of decisions? So basically, the more yeses, the higher the likelihood that you might be your team or your organization might be experience high workload. So based on that, I want us to just delve a little bit deeper onto the most common factors contributing to perception of high workload. So why do I call it perception of high workload? Because in some instances, the amount of work is the problem. There's too much of it to complete in those work hours. But in a lot of other instances, it's not the amount of work that's the problem, is what we've seen before in effective work systems. And why is this important? This is important because when you think about implementing controls, hiring more staff is not the solution, right? What the solution is to look at those systems and replace them. That's the solution, right? So that's why it's important for us to start thinking about why underpinning causes of high workload is really crucial so that we can implement effective controls. So in effective work systems, I can tell you, I have yet to come across an organization that uses an SAP system, and I don't know if you're familiar with that, maybe you are, maybe you are not, but I have yet to come across an SAP system that works well, that does not create high workload for people and frustration. I don't know how they've been designed, but they have been designed potentially to be psychosocial risks, honestly. And I'm saying this as a joke, but honestly, for people who use them, it's no joke. Unclear processes. This is another common one. So organizations evolve over time as it's natural. And sometimes checking that processes are clear to everyone really is forgotten. Or after organizational change, particularly poorly managed organizational change, we see changes in structures, and therefore that affect also the way different processes are performed. Lack of role clarity is a big one. And this is, again, we usually talk about someone's role and responsibilities as soon as they begin work with the company, right? The manager has a conversation with them and it's all good. But as our roles progress over time, they also change, which is normal, right? I mean, change is part of an organization, change is part of life. If you will, it's the only constant in life, right? So that's normal. But one of the things that we forget to do is to check in regarding that clarity around what are our responsibilities. Are we still on the same page with what's required of us? Do we still understand what's needed for us to succeed in the organization? Are we receiving conflicting information from different sources in the organization, and then we don't know what to prioritize, right? And when you don't know what to prioritize, you lose a lot of time trying to do everything, right? And that's role conflict. I got ahead of myself. So role conflict is, as I mentioned before, when you receive conflicting information from different parties in an organization. So role clarity and role conflict, they usually work together or are related, if you will. Incivility, as I mentioned before, that disrespect, that strained relationship between different teams is actually, or between the members of a team, right? It's actually a big factor that significantly can increase high workload. And I'll give you some examples why. So incivility is a very interesting phenomenon. Probably the most famous researchers in the world that have been looking at this, they're called Pearson and Pora, and they work at Harvard University. And they've been looking at incivility over the past decade, and they have a very interesting study published that's called the cost of incivility. So what they did is they worked with different organizations, and they actually were able to measure what's costing us, what's the price of it. So they were able to find that amongst the people who were on the receiving end of disrespectful behaviors, 48% of them intentionally decreased their effort at work. 80% of them lost working time ruminating about the incident. 60% of them lost working time trying to avoid the offender. So you notice how this is working here, right? So basically, we lose time dealing with that particular incident. Or like Eric, now he feels uncomfortable to go to ask those people for information he needs. So he loses a lot of time trying to find alternate ways to get that information, right? And what that means is that his work accumulates, and therefore he has to work overtime in order to meet his job demands, right? And when we think about, okay, how do we solve that from a control point of view, hiring more staff again is not necessarily the right option, but rather we have to look at why isn't Eric getting the information he needs? We need to address that cause if it is incivility. What's causing that team to be abrasive to him? And it could be not necessarily that they are, trying to be mean to Eric. It could be that these people are overworked. If they are overworked, then what's causing that, right? So this is how we find real causes and we implement controls that are actually likely to be effective. Another really important factor that we also saw in our example with Eric was that always on culture. And I have it as ineffective communication. Why? Because a lot of organizations would say in their manifesto or code of conduct or whatever, we care about your employees, take time off, it's okay to disconnect. But then what happens is you might be the only person in the team that has access to one system or that knows an answer to something. So whenever you're on leave, you actually have to pick up the call because there's no one else to do that. That's just one example when the always on culture is there. Or you feel that if you don't keep up with the messages or what's going on in the organization, you're going to fall so far behind that you won't be able to catch up. So even when you're on leave, you keep on checking those messages. This usually happens in startups where you see massive growth and things changing quite fast. Ineffective workforce planning. This is much more common than you would think. And unfortunately, it's got serious consequences. Staff shortages. Again, sometimes you just don't find the right skill set that you need to hire people, and that's significantly difficult for the team members who experience that. Rapid growth, I talked about that already, and high cognitive load, I also talked about that. So with high cognitive load, the idea is this. So when you have to remember a lot of things, pay attention to a lot of things, that uses up energy, as in on a physical level, your brain uses up a lot of energy. So you become tired and therefore more inefficient when you do work. And so that means that two things. One, you perceive that you are doing a lot of work when in fact, it is really the fact that the type of work that you do puts a big strain on your reserves. And then the other thing is, as you become more and more inefficient, obviously, it is harder for you to complete the work tasks during the allocated work time. Ineffective work systems and high cognitive load usually work together, as well as unclear processes. Those three things tend to, at least from our audits, those are three factors that tend to compound. They tend to be there together. So why don't we talk about how do we manage high workload, right? We looked at the causes and we looked at the importance of finding the real cause behind high workload. So I want to give you maybe 5 principles. I'm not going to be able to give you controls and say, okay, here are the best controls for high workload. Why? Because I don't know what's really going on in your organization. And there is no control or example of an intervention that will always work, right? Pretty simple. There's not one size fits all. There's not even one size fits you and the next person, right? So that's why I can't give you that, but I can give you principles of how to think about creating controls that are effective for your people. So the first one is, beyond doubt, getting leadership commitment. So this is something that I see time and time again, even with our risk assessments in organizations where the leadership is aware of the risk that psychosocial hazards pose, and when they're actually committed to making changes, things go well and changes do happen. But in organizations, when that leadership is not that much on board, change is slow to come by. So getting leadership commitment is really important. And I know here I'm guessing that you're all kind of agreeing. So I might be preaching to the converted, but what are ways for you, if you are not in a leadership position, or maybe you're not a senior leader, how can you do that? So usually, so I recommend you build a business case. And so, for example, with our clients, we always build a business case that they present to their senior leaders. And some of the things that we include in that business case are showing your senior leaders what risk they are exposing their organizations to if they do nothing about psychosocial risk, or if they just try to, mumble through it without actually being doing an accurate risk assessment, right? So what's the risk? So show them, obviously you have the compliance risk that's really good on your side. Some states have the manslaughter laws. I mean, that can be a stretch, but it can be a really good incentive for senior leaders and board executives, like, oh, okay, you have all the data that shows us the relationship with psychosocial risk and worker compensation claims. You can get that data from WorkSafe Australia, and you can look at your particular state. So worker compensation claims, how much it's costing the organization. And then obviously you have the link with productivity, right? So those are some ways in which you can build in your business case and show them, look, if we don't do this, this is what we are exposing ourselves to. The second thing is run a risk assessment that is actually accurate, right? So that means that you should consult your staff in an unbiased manner. So oftentimes, companies would decide to run focus groups internally. And that's fine if you have a high trust organizational culture. But most of the time, people feel nervous about discussing psychosocial risk matters if their anonymity and confidentiality is not ensured, because they are afraid there might be repercussions on their employment, right? So keep that into account. So then how can you consult your people in a way that gives you valid data, right? We've already talked about the importance of understanding what's causing high workload, so I'm not going to go into that anymore. And the one of the key factors in managing all psychosocial hazards and high workload specifically is the work done by the line manager, because line managers are absolutely crucial in the management of psychosocial risk, right? Their role is crucial because most people, as a reporting process in most organizations, is your first point of contact is going to be your line manager. If you can't talk to your line manager, there will always be other avenues, but your line manager has a very important role also in the controls put in place, right? So a lot of managers are not aware of what psychosocial risk is, what their responsibilities are, how to have conversations with their reports about psychosocial risk, and most importantly, how to put in place controls. That is why, that's because we've identified this massive gap, that is why we've been training organizations and their managers to do just that. And we do it very practically. So we get scenarios from that context, the real life scenario, right? And we get managers to analyze the scenario and to learn, okay, this is what you could say next. You know, we usually have like a conversation between a manager and the report. And then we ask managers, okay, is what was said a psychosocial hazard, yes or no? If you were the manager, what would you say next? What would you do next? So we help them understand, what is this? What's this risk? How can I talk to my people about it? What controls I can put in place to support my people with anything, including high workload, right? And the role of the health and safety reps is really, really important in monitoring, in identifying different types of hazards, including high workload. So when we think about high workload management, we need to praise our health and safety reps and ensure that they are supported in the organization to spot and report things, right? So I want to give you a quick case study. So let's look in practice how this looks. So this is one organization we worked with. We never share names. We sign NDAs with all of our clients because the content we deal with is quite sensitive. So about 350 employees. The well-being strategy was sitting with HR. Health and safety had separate goals. It was a male-dominated industry, and so the problem that they came to us with was staff was complaining about high workload. They had high staff turnover in certain teams. There were anecdotal signs of burnout among staff. So staff was saying, "Oh, I'm super burnt out and I'm stressed," but they didn't have any data around, okay, what is the actual burnout score of the organization? They also had an organizational history of silos. So teams weren't really communicating well with each other. And they were noticing that right now that poor communication was beginning to affect service delivery. And they had no data about psychosocial hazards or actual burnout scores. So what we did is we did a risk assessment, and this is just some highlights of the results. Obviously not everything, because we go over 30 hazards. It's quite a significant piece of work, but this is just some highlights. So what we found with them is that underlying causes of high workload were high cognitive load and poor work systems, so no surprise there. There was a lack of role and process clarity, especially because they had gone through an organizational change that was not well managed. They had a lot of incivility, probably some of the highest rates I had seen since we've been doing these audits in the past year. So quite a lot of incivility, and a lot of it was fueled by that culture of silos and the culture of what the previous leadership, they used to have a previous toxic leadership. And unfortunately, the time spent under that toxic leadership had really affected the whole culture of the organization. And the new leadership they were really awesome. I actually enjoyed working with them a lot, and there was a genuine commitment to change. And the organization was almost fractured into part of the organization believed in the new leadership and they were willing to work together to make a change, and then there was a part that was really if you will, traumatized by the past, and they were quite stuck into that old mentality. They did have staff shortage in certain teams, especially those teams that were experiencing high turnover. And 35% of their staff was at severe or very severe risk of burnout. That's a really high percentage. So we did a lot of things with them and supporting them. But what was really good is that they came together, so different departments came together to work on psychosocial risk. And I think that's really important because this is one area where health and safety needs to work really close to HR, because some of the hazards really overlap. Like high workload is one example of that. If there's workload accommodations, HR will be involved as well. If there's offensive behaviors like bullying, harassment, so on, HR will be involved as well, right? They redrafted the strategies, so they aligned. They did targeted interventions to clarify roles and processes. And with this, when we give the recommendations for controls, we share templates with our clients because we want them to be empowered to do this work themselves. So we gave them a couple of templates of how to go about doing this process. And they did it, and it was really good. They also created a working group to update the IT system. So this is we always, in our recommendations, we always recommend this approach, particularly when dealing with IT change, with systems change, sorry. And a work group model, I'll give it to you very quickly, is the idea is have an executive leader as a sponsor. Then from each team that uses that system, you need to have representatives. You can have some managers, yes, but really important is to have people who use it in their day-to-day, right? The frontline staff, if you will. So one representative from each team, and then you go through a series of needs analysis of how each team uses that system, and through a process of having a sandpit, if you will, when you trial the the particular system. This is obviously an overview. There's a simple process to follow there, but this is just a quick overview. So we also did with them an intervention on civility and respect and our well-being protocol. These are just some of the issues highlighted. And I just want to say, with regards to solutions. So, and I guess now's the time to come back to that question that someone asked before in the chat regarding implementing controls at individual level for high workload. So the idea is this: when you go through a risk assessment, you will see if that is a problem at team level, business unit level, location level, whatever. So it is important to understand if the particular risk you are dealing with is only individual or if it affects more people, because then the controls will obviously be different. When it comes, let's take the example here. I mentioned to you that there were different reasons that underpin high workload for them. But in some teams, one of the main reasons was staff shortage. So then we looked at ourselves, what is it about these teams that means they have such high turnover? And so a couple of things, but probably the most important ones were a couple of managers who were particularly toxic, for lack of a better word. So they were really responsible for high turnover. So the idea is here, okay, what do we do? What do we do? Okay, we can implement some workforce planning, but then we can look at what do we do with those managers? We train them, we replace them, what's going on there? That needs to be addressed, and immediately in one way or another. And two, when you look at work design, so what can you do if there's high workload and there's low staff shortage? So you have one team member doing two roles, for example. What can you do there? So when you think from a work design perspective, first of all, you need to work out with your manager, what are the team priorities? And what is your skill set? What are you best suited to do? When you match those things, you see, or you combine them to identify what that particular person's priorities will be and how many tasks are reasonable for one full-time role to be completed within the allocated work hours. And then you ask yourself, okay, what tasks can be done by another team member? What tasks can be completely admin and done by another team, for example? Or are there a series of tasks that can be done by a contractor, right? So these are all questions. There is a document around work design that I recommend that you read. It is published by WorkSafe New South Wales, I believe. If you just Google, I think the title is Work Design as Psychosocial Risk Management or something like that, using work design to manage psychosocial risk. I think that's the title. Google around that and it's going to come up, and I recommend you read that document. So coming back to our case study here, results that we've seen, because we do the audits obviously every year. We've seen an 18% reduction in severe and very severe burnout risk scores. We've seen a 15% reduction in severe job demand scores, as in workload perception, 20% improvement in job resources categories such as support from supervisors, support from colleagues, and role clarity. And this is massive, right? Massive gains. And the qualitative data also showed positive appraisal. So that's really the end. But I am happy to, we have 9 minutes left, and so I'm happy to address your questions. I think there was a question at the beginning that I said I was going to address now, and I don't remember, but I'm going to scroll. Yeah, how to address exposure when it is part of the everyday work. So a couple of things here. So of course, there will always be psychosocial risks that are inherent to particular jobs. So they will not be able to be eliminated. Now, whether high workload is an example of that or not, I would tend to say no here. Obviously, this is going to depend on the specific context of the organization, and it's going to be at the discretion of an inspector, for example, if you're audited. But normally, if you think about it, I do not believe personally that high workload is or should be considered inherent to work. Not like, for example, exposure to traumatic events is inherent to the work of first responders or healthcare, for example. Yeah, that's part of their work, or prosecutors, right? Yeah, they are exposed to traumatic content. We cannot eliminate that. Or customer aggression is going to be inherent in the work of anyone that deals with customers, right? Whether it be retail or call center or whatever. Yes, that's a hazard we cannot eliminate because we can't control, how people behave. We can't control the type of events and information that comes through to personnel in, frontline response or prosecutors or whatever, right? We can't control that. But the amount of work in your organization, you should be able to control that over a period of time. Yes, you can have peaks and troughs. That happens. That's okay. But again, even if you know that I have peaks and troughs, how do I plan for the peak, right? So here again, workforce planning is important. Work design is important, right? Understanding what are the trends in my organization. And if you've seen that you've experienced high workload for a long period of time, then ask yourself, okay, what's going on here? Is it just because we've normalized it and we've decided, if people still struggle on and they don't complain, we're just going to keep doing it, right? I see one question there. Is it possible to get a copy of the PowerPoint presentation? I'll talk to the organizers and we'll let you know after that. Is 55 hours per week the tipping point? Well, according to the research, yes, it is. But we all have individual, not necessarily preferences. So think about it this way, right? When you think of a person's well-being, I'm going to take that as an example, and you'll understand where I'm getting with that in a moment. So one of the definitions of well-being from the research literature is the balance point between the resources you have to meet the challenges that come your way inevitably in life, right? That's the same for us. And challenges is not something negative, right? We need challenges in order to remain stimulated. But the idea is that we have a certain resource pool, right, to meet those challenges, both in our personal life and our work life. And so some of those resources have to do with, the level of health that we have, the nutrition that we currently have, the level of physical exercise we engage in. So for some people, perhaps they can manage to work 55 plus hours a week without immediately feeling negative outcomes. But any individual will ultimately feel a negative impact on their health. How long it takes, that really depends on the individual, right? It depends, as I said, on their health, on what they eat, how much they exercise, the level of social connection they feel in their life, if there's any past trauma that we know about, if there's compounding factors in their personal life, right? So if they're going through a relationship breakup, for example. So all of this will determine what that tipping point for anyone is. And even for ourselves, like I noticed when I was younger, I had more energy. Now I am dealing with a health situation, and I noticed that my ability to deal with stress at work and the amount of hours that I would put in is severely diminished, like severely. So now for me, the tipping point is well below 55. And that's because there's an emerging health condition, and that's it. It reduced my resources significantly, right? So you will see within yourself fluctuations in that over time. So I hope that answers your point. All right. Do we have anything else as a question? I don't think we do. Yeah, I'm just going through the comments now just to make sure I didn't miss anything as I was going through this. Yep, I think that's it. Oh, I see one question. Is it compulsory to have workforce planning and well-being strategy for every organization? So well-being strategy, certainly not. It is compulsory for you to have a health and safety strategy, and most organizations are now moving to include well-being there, as I personally believe it should. Workforce planning, now compulsory to me, that word makes me think of like legal requirement. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't really advise on that, but your HR, so workforce planning usually sits with HR, so your HR will know to what extent that's a requirement. So yeah, I can't answer that question, sorry. If you could point me to where to find, so most states and countries really would have some form of employment law. And so maybe that's a good point to start, but really the point to start, talk to your HR. So go to your HR business partner or HR person and have a chat with them. They will know the law. Awesome, cool. Thank you for the feedback. Really appreciate it. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful. Thanks so much.
Okay, well, thank you very much to our presenter today, Dr. Georgi Toma from Heart and Brain Works, for her webinar, High Workload, Underlying Causes and Effective Controls. Today's webinar has been run as part of WorkSafe Tasmania Month. Please head to worksafe.tas.gov.au to see what other webinars and in-person events we are running throughout the month of October. WorkSafe Tasmania Month is an initiative that is funded by the WorkCover Board Tasmania. To rewatch today's webinar, which has been recorded, please go to WorkSafe Tasmania's YouTube page. Thank you again to our presenter, and thank you for everyone for attending. Please have a safe and healthy rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye.